Okay, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to start the webinar.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar titled Battling Injustices, AAPI Advocates Share Their Stories. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This program will be recorded. The recording will be made available soon on our website, www.njcivilrights.gov. Given this is a webinar, all audience members' cameras and microphones will be off. Your participation is important to us. If you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A tab. Questions can be directed to all panelists or specific individuals. Questions can also be submitted anonymously. Due to time constraints, please keep all questions on topic. Resource links and contact information will be shared in the chat tab throughout the program. If you experience any technical difficulties tonight, please explain your problem through the Q&A tab, and we will try our best to address the issue. Lastly, please follow the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights on Facebook and Twitter at Civil Rights NJ for the latest news, resources, and information from our office. Again, welcome. I now turn it over to the Director of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, Sandeep Iyer.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for the introduction, Patricia. My name is Sandeep Iyer, and I have the great privilege of serving, as Patricia mentioned, as the Director of the Division on Civil Rights here in New Jersey. I'm also proud to identify as Indian American and AAPI, and so I'm really happy to be with you for this event celebrating AAPI Heritage Month. By some measures, New Jersey is the most diverse state in the country. Our AAPI community in particular is the fastest growing community in New Jersey and now numbers over 1 million people, which is remarkable. That diversity is our strength as a state, and I'm really proud to have been raised in and represent a state that celebrates and embraces its diversity. But I think all of us know that there's a lot more work for us to do to build the kind of state we want to live in, the kind of state that values all of its residents and that ensures that no one here faces discrimination, no matter their race or ethnicity or any other protected characteristic. That work, I think, is especially important in this moment as our state and the country as a whole continue to experience a rapid uptick in hate and bias, including hate and bias incidents against our AAPI community. Under Governor Murphy's leadership and Attorney General Platkin's leadership, we at the Division on Civil Rights have been committed to continuing our work to address bias and discrimination across our state. We're piloting key initiatives to tackle housing discrimination, including mortgage redlining, home appraisal discrimination, discrimination against people based on prior criminal history. We're developing new solutions as an agency to tackle hate and bias and its uptick in our schools, including developing innovative initiatives like our community relations unit's Community Peacemaker Collaborative, developing trainings for schools on how to respond to bias incidents in the classroom, and bringing cases where discrimination happens in our schools. And we're tackling paid discrimination, pregnancy discrimination, violations of our Family Leave Act, disability discrimination, and so many other issues that unfortunately deny our residents, including our AAPI residents, equal economic opportunity. But for all the work we're doing here at the Division on Civil Rights, we know that we can't do this work alone. And that's why we're so grateful for partnerships with organizations like the ACLU, the Alliance for Immigrant Justice, NEA, organizations that are represented in today's event. And those organizations work every day to make change. Tonight, we're really pleased to present this webinar to lift up the voices of some fierce AAPI advocates who work on intersectional social justice issues. They are bridge builders who are civil rights leaders in our state, and they're part of organizations that are pushing forward policies, initiatives, litigation that support vulnerable and marginalized populations here in New Jersey. We are so grateful for their work on behalf of all New Jerseyans every single day. We hope at Bottom that this webinar will encourage more people, including all of you, to speak up, stand up for intersectional equity, for justice, and to be in community with neighbors and fellow New Jerseyans, no matter what walk of life you're coming from. And I think that's what's at the heart of tonight's event. So again, I just want to thank you all for being here and making time for this important conversation. And I'll turn it back over to the wonderful organizers of tonight's event, our incredible community relations unit. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sandeep. Apologies, all I had trouble unmuting. Good evening. On behalf of the Division's Community Relations Unit, which I am a part of, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers, Ami, Kat, and Gabriel. Please come on camera. Thank you. Okay. And I'd like to invite each of you to take a turn and briefly introduce yourself, first by stating your full name and organization, and then by completing this storytelling prompt. I am proud to be a social justice advocate. People would be surprised. I also blank. So, Kat, would you like to start?
Of course, and thank you so much to everyone here for offering us the space and platform to share more about our stories. My name is Kat Fan. My pronouns are she, hers. I am the Policy and Research Associate with the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice, focusing on a variety of state-level policy work. But above all of this, I am a proud daughter of Vietnamese refugees. I come from a background in anti-detention organizing, immigrant rights work long before the work is paid and professional. And by and large, I should say I'm proud to be doing the work and offering the labor I do, because it is a way for me to not only feel politically connected to my community and those who look and don't look like me, but also to preserve, the cultural heritage and all of the wholeness of migrant communities that have raised me and brought me up. And every time I do this work, it feels like coming full circle again and again. On the other hand, people will be surprised that this is not all I do, but it encompasses a lot of how I navigate through the world. I am currently working on a series of one-acts and monologues. I am a playwright outside of my organizing work, and a lot of the work that I do has to do with storytelling. So that's both, in the policy world, obviously, advocacy means a lot of good storytelling, but also in the creative realm as well. So whenever that gets off the ground, I'm always happy to share more about it. I'll pass it to Ami.
Thanks, Kat. And echoing what Kat said earlier, really grateful to DCR for organizing this and for the invitation to participate. My name is Annika Talia. My pronouns are she, her. I work at the ACLU of New Jersey, which is a civil rights organization, both in New Jersey and across the country, that's committed to both protecting and expanding the rights of all people. I work most closely on issues of immigrants' rights and also drug policy. And I'm really proud to be doing this work because as someone who's been born and raised here, who feels really deeply connected to other New Jerseyans and to this community, it's a real privilege to be able to do work every day that's about building communities up and about making sure that we're removing obstacles in the way that allow everyone to really feel as though they belong. And I think one thing maybe people might be surprised by or curious to know perhaps is that I'm a knitter. And so when I'm not doing advocacy work and at rallies or at the State House, you'll probably find me knitting a sweater. And I will pass to Gabe.
Thank you both for setting the stage. The introductions, Gabriel Tanglaro, he, him pronouns. Currently serve as the manager of the Human and Civil Rights Department in the National Education Association. So that represents educators across the country. And I started the journey in New Jersey, of course, with the New Jersey Education Association. And previous to that, I was a high school social studies teacher up in Bergenfield, New Jersey, which is right next to my hometown, which the second largest Filipino population in the state. So it's really beautiful to be able to come up in a community that is culturally reflective of our cultural wealth. And yeah, just really grateful to be focused on human and civil rights, racial, social, economic justice, educational justice in this moment in particular. And just looking forward to the dialogue. Something that might surprise folks, I'd say in the same spirit of what was shared earlier with creative pursuits, also being connected to our activism. I do spoken word poetry and try to express some of my own radical energy through the arts in that way. So it's one thing that might surprise you.
Oh, still trouble with the unmute button. Thank you all for sharing. Audience members, you'll note in the chat that the speakers' bios have all been dropped in the chat. Okay. And if you are not able to see them, they will be made available on the Division on Civil Rights website. Again, Division on Civil Rights, we refer to ourselves as DCR. So if you hear us saying DCR this evening, that is the Division on Civil Rights. And our website is very simply njcivilrights.gov. So let's help the audience learn a little bit more about each of you. And I will start with Gabriel, since you spoke last. Okay. So you identify as a first-generation born Filipino American or second-generation American. And you mentioned previously that you grew up in a predominantly white suburb. And I read in an interview that quote, the foundation of your understanding of racial justice issues and community organizing came through your cultural liberation in college. So please talk more about your roads traveled, and then I will go to Ami and then to Kat. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, my hometown is up in North Jersey. It's Dumont, New Jersey, which is a small town up north. But my parents, my mother's from Manila and my father's from Angeles City. When they migrated to the United States, they actually met here and started the family, started the home, and you know, really grateful for the foundation of the life, access to safe communities, public school system, and you know, that enabled me and my younger brother to navigate into higher education. I'd say, as was mentioned in the context that you shared, you know, in terms of diversity and just representation and cultural wealth is the frame that I make sure to credit to Dr. Tarayaso. That's just become part of my own framing. The cultural wealth wasn't as abundant in my hometown, but in college, it was actually the Black Student Union and other cultural organizations and student activists that were the foundation for my liberation consciousness. I actually started as a business major, interested in becoming a CEO of a company. Not that that's necessarily a negative thing. I don't want to frame it in that way. But once I became politically conscious through the student activism, through some of the courses, and just becoming more aware of myself and my context of the world, and also my own cultural background in a more politically aware way, that's when it started to channel a deeper self-exploration and caused me to change my major from business to political science. And through that coursework and through a more rigorous interrogation of self and community and political systems in which we exist in the United States, that's what led me to be more active, right, in student protests, organizing on campus, even things like the Model United Nations, which was another organization on campus that enabled me to become even more globally conscious and deepen my knowledge there. But that whole journey led to ultimately the question, how can I be most impactful in changing the world, right? And that's what led down the road to becoming a teacher. And it was through my profession as a teacher and then becoming active in the union that I started to really set the foundation for my activism in my adult life. There's more to the story, but that's the portion that was the genesis of what drives my passion today still. So love to hear some of my panelists and their backstory as well.
Thank you, Gabriel. Ami, I understand you studied political science as well, and you also studied women's and gender studies at Rutgers, and that you previously worked at the Drug Policy Alliance and now also serve as the board chair of the New Jersey Harm Reduction Coalition. In addition, of course, to your position at ACLU. Please tell us more about the paths that led you here.
Sure, thank you. You know, I think like many people who grow up as the child of immigrants, that's like a very unique space to occupy. And I think when you do, it almost creates this consciousness in you where it's almost inevitable that you are curious about the world around you and curious about the ways in which policy and politics impact your lives and the lives of your family and your community. And so I think that's always been something that I've cared very deeply about. I'm also someone who became a caregiver fairly early for a sick parent. And I think, and I'm sure many people experience this when they are caregivers, that it necessitates advocacy. To be a caregiver is to be an advocate and to also understand the ways in which systems are set up to both help people, but also to obstruct, right? Who are systems built for? Who are they not built for? And so I think that coupled with, like Gabe, school and really studying political science and women's and gender studies, and finally having language for things that I had experienced really propelled me forward. And so when I graduated, I knew I wanted to do work in the policy and advocacy space. And I was really inspired by all of the work happening here in New Jersey. I think oftentimes when you're learning about policy issues, and when you're in school or when you're younger, you often look to federal issues because that's what's most available in the press and it's what you're learning about. And so for me, I really, really appreciated being able to do work though at the state level, where there's such an opportunity to work with communities on the ground and to make a difference in terms of passing laws or policies, and to see it, to feel it in your everyday life too. And so that's really been my journey, just as someone who went from caring about the issue to developing language and community around issues, and then getting to do this work as well.
Thank you, Ami. Now, Kat, you spoke earlier about being a child of refugees and about your Vietnamese background. And I read on your work profile that your commitment to immigrant justice is rooted in your desire to co-create a world where immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees like your parents can be their fullest selves and live or dream as imaginatively and freely as they desire. That is beautiful. Could you share more about your personal journey?
Yes, absolutely. Obviously echoing a lot of what Gabe and Ami have already said. I think something that has been a through line in the mission statement that you just shared that I wrote is, I think, growing up in a city that was either half of it was completely like refugee immigrant communities, and the other half were Black families and maybe not too many white families. It became very apparent that either local governments or other, folks who weren't invested in the well-being of Black and Brown immigrant communities and families were really used to either picking apart our differences and pitting us against each other. I think I'm going to really lean on what Ami said about a lot of these systems abstract away humanity and individuals from the actual lived experience. Kind of going between a lot of different homes. Growing up, I saw myself in a way of thinking, why does my family back at home not be able to, how doesn't have the capacity to speak Vietnamese and get access to resources or government services, whereas my family, say in this enclave in California, can do that better. And it brings a lot of questions about, what does it take for someone who has just come into a new country, maybe against their will, maybe not with all the resources or access to things that they need. What does it take for them to feel their full embodied self? That's something that's always driven how I think and navigate through the world. And, quite honestly, still seeing my very old parents today, I don't think I have an answer. I think the answer is always evolving. But I want to share a little bit more about my journey coming to this. I know a lot of folks have become either politicized or radicalized either early on or dove into advocacy work early in the career. I started off as an engineering student, also with like creative interests as well. But for a long time, I really tried to do the organizing outside of my, 9 to 5 or my studies and whatnot. And I share this as a way of saying maybe some folks on the call are thinking, well, I can't, drop my career entirely, or I can't drop my current work. Maybe I'm trying to bring in a friend into this work, but I don't want to either intimidate them with the breadth of the issues that are facing our communities today. And I think it's really important to know that, being part of the struggle is just showing up and doing the best that you can. And that's what's looping me into knowing what it's like to live my fullest self here.
Thank you all for sharing. And so each of you have outlined how your journey, has brought you to your current day. But can you speak more specifically about what propelled you into your current role in your current positions? And I'll start with Kat now.
Yeah, perfect segue. I shared a little bit earlier, I did start off, a little bit aware of the issues that were impacting folks that looks like me or my family elders. And it wasn't until I went to school that I was able to put somewhat of a political framework on it. And that's just knowing that the concepts of, say, oh, well, obviously I know that not all Asians do well in school. I grew up with cousins, family members, a lot of folks who experience hardship on the streets really struggled, and a lot of experience were invalidated. But I got to learn specific contexts in which those ideas were constructed and who they harmed and whatnot. But I really thought, again, I loved doing the organizing work in school, but I also very realistically did not come from a background where, my family could pay for my expenses or really support me. So I tried to choose a career in which maybe I would have both a really cushy life and also continue to do extremely emotionally taxing anti-detention organizing back in California. I quickly learned that could not be the case for me. I know for some folks, they're able to do it, but I was very, very lucky that an advisor encouraged me to move into immigrant affairs entirely, with the advice that, you know, if you want to continue in this work, you can. If you always want to return to, for me, I was a researcher and a data scientist for a little bit, but if you always want to return to that, you also can. I think he really encouraged me to embrace the idea of the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And I've kind of taken that and gone with it as well. Kind of moving through that, I've really followed the thread of immigrant justice in most localities that I've been in. I really want to echo folks here who have said that the work is important because when it's local and you can impact folks and hear from folks who are being impacted directly by policies and programs. And so happy to be here today with the Alliance and continue that.
I think Kat was popcorning over to you, Ami.
Thank you. You know, I think for me, in terms of this work, as you mentioned earlier, before I came to the ACLU, I worked at the Drug Policy Alliance. And before that, I actually worked somewhere else where I got to sort of see this 30,000-foot view of public policy issues in New Jersey. And it kind of gave me an understanding of everything that was going on the ground. But what brought me to my work now today is really work around drug policy, and that's where it started. Drug policy is one of those issues that I think on the face of it, people think they have an understanding of it or they've experienced it sometimes in their real lives. But it's such an intersectional issue. It cuts across issues around housing, around economic justice, around the criminal legal system, around immigrants' rights. And it really pulled me in because I realized that the more I kept looking, there were more and more threads to pull apart where there was clear injustice and there's clearly changes that we could make from an advocacy perspective and a policy perspective to improve people's lives. You know, I am a campaign strategist, which means that I do a bit of policy analysis work and organizing work and coalition work and comms work. It's kind of a collection of things that goes and lets us advocate and help change policies and laws. And I think what got me here is really learning from a lot of other people in the space and benefiting from kind of their generosity in terms of teaching me about this work and like allowing me the room to grow into it as well. You know, when I was younger, I always thought I'd want to work on immigrants' rights. And so in a way, all my work has sort of like gone full circle. Immigrants' rights is so deeply personal to me because of my family's own experience. And as I've gone through with the work, I realized that so much of the work, whether it's labeled immigrants' rights or not, is actually immigrants' rights work. And so much of work that, regardless of how we might label it, whatever silo we might put it in, really this work is so deeply connected. And so I think that's how I've gotten to my current work, which is really around looking at the many ways in which we can impact policy, be it on specific issues that I like regularly work on or random things that come up, but that are really about making sure at the end of the day, we're prioritizing racial justice, that we're prioritizing people's rights and creating opportunity. And I think there's so many different ways in which we can do that. And I'll pass to Gabe.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed listening to more of y'all's story, and I was just reflecting on just the beginning portion, being in the teaching profession, and really prior to taking both feet, diving right into the full-time union work that centers economic justice, but the way that I leaned into that space around racial and social justice was still rooted in the passion and advocacy I had for my students and the families that our school community served. But I'm sitting with the quote earlier of that Kat shared: the master's house cannot be dismantled with the master's tools, the Audre Lorde. So part of the experience getting into the classroom with, as I mentioned earlier, fresh off of student activism, looking to change the world, and then being confronted with the various policies and system and the way that the education system, the public education system is designed, and some of the ways that it, as by design, is depending on the district you're from, well-resourced for some, under-resourced for others. And that's just a reflection of the various inequities that are built into a variety of different systems, from healthcare, to education, to housing, so on and so forth, that it was a reality check, is really where I'm processing in real time with you all in this dialogue, is that once the first few years of just focusing on my craft and developed, and I'm also going to humanize myself in this moment. I realize we're on a panel. I'm also hearing my daughter, who's 1.5 years old, prepare for bedtime. So that's a little bit of a distraction in the background, but to tie it into this conversation and dialogue, being a new father and thinking about even just building the foundation for the next generation of young folks is difficult enough, right? It's difficult enough to do that, let alone facing some of the institutional barriers and challenges that many of the families that we served in Bergenfield and other school districts, I witnessed firsthand, right? But what did that all mean in propelling me to leave the classroom, which I loved? I did not want to leave the classroom because I loved the work that I was doing and the impact, the direct impact that teaching provides. It wasn't until I understood that the union in particular is an organization that primarily focuses on supporting educators to be sustainable in this work, to harness their skills to be more inclusive and equitable, and race conscious, right? Critically conscious, and find ways to infuse that into their practice. And that opportunity was intriguing to me, which called me to the professional development spaces within the union, and also the community of like-minded and like-hearted comrades across other school districts, across the state, ultimately across the country, and then finding, my squad, my village of people that are about this life, about their work, facing different challenges in their own communities, in their own schools, that I was like, all right, this is a space where if I focus my energy fully, we could actually move the needle on certain things, right? Because of the scale of impact across the state that we can have. So that was one step in the direction of being full-time union staff. Much of that time was focused on the professional development. So some of the policy work, some of the advocacy work, and some of the professional development work converged, similar to what was shared. Like, we have to have a multitude of skills to be able to endeavor in this work. But it was about 2 years ago where the New Jersey Education Association, the state affiliate part of the union that I was working at, started a human and civil rights division to really expand the work for racial and social justice, particularly in this time where there is political interest in advancing, I'll just call it regressive policies, anti-LGBTQ. They frame it as anti-CRT, but really what we like to say in our spaces is the ability to teach the truth and true history. So it's a long way of saying that what propelled me into the work with the union, particularly focused on racial and social justice work, that drew me out of the classroom, was just the opportunity to have an impact on a larger scale. And really grateful now to be able to try to channel that on a national level, but so much more work to do.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Ami and Kat. So now I'm going to invite you all to pivot a little bit and have more of a conversational style, informal, because I know that two of you at least, Kat and Ami, your work overlaps, and certainly with Gabe to some extent. And I'm going to invite you to talk about a specific keystone social justice and equity issue that you are currently working on that disrupts anti-Blackness, that disrupts homophobia, that disrupts xenophobia, and all the isms. And so I invite you to have a conversation and to share your wisdom with our audience. And feel free to take turns or to popcorn to one another or to overlap one another. We all can give grace and time.
If y'all are cool with it, I'll just jump in and just build on a point where I left off. Part of the work that we're doing currently is to take a look at just the larger liberatory learning ecosystem for educators. Where do they access their own race consciousness resources, professional development, leadership development, and in what ways are we moving from awareness and literacy to practice and implementation, with the hope that practice and implementation and capacity building in that respect leads to culture shift, right? Culture shift within school districts, culture shift within organizations. And if that liberatory learning ecosystem, which, and I'll name some of the content that we're addressing, of course, implicit bias, but what's beyond implicit bias, right? So if we are all aware that we are all socialized, not only as educators, but as adults growing up in the system, that white supremacy culture and patriarchy is the norm and the dominant culture, what's the cultural wealth framework? And I've referenced Dr. Tariasso, who has the community cultural wealth framework as just a way to reframe what's normally seen as deficit for historically marginalized communities, and look at some of the resourcefulness and resilience that actually manifest in forms of cultural capital and cultural wealth. And then in what ways does that frame change the thinking from implicit bias to looking at, AAPI students, Black and Brown students, migrant students as cultural wealth, linguistic capital, right? Social capital that they're bringing into the school and spaces as one layer of the adult learning, that content that we offer, but also talking about things like power, understanding power literacy. The brother name is Eric Liu, Citizen University, talks about the 6 sources of power, and in what ways do we as people fighting for justice, whether it be within the union space, whether it be within schools, whether it be part of a larger social change ecosystem, how are we leveraging our powers both on an individual level, interpersonal level, and then like a system-wide level, structural level. So these are some of the new, content that we're offering through our professional development spaces, both, virtual and also at our conferences. So really excited about this work because I'll just end this point on, I went into the teaching profession with the belief and the theory of change that that education truly does have the power to shift, to change the world. So in what ways are we directing that energy and that skill set to the adults who have gone most of their lives without, well, I can't broadly blanket that because those who have lived experience, right, has often have a greater consciousness around these issues, and not by choice, right? But how do we, as Hami said earlier, how do we language that? How do we grow our own racial literacy and race consciousness to be able to articulate, analyze, and then take action to disrupt some of the patterns of inequity that we see? So that's some of the work we're doing in the liberatory learning ecosystem space and professional development space.
I love all of that so much. And I have so many follow-up questions, but maybe we'll save it for the audience Q&A afterwards too. But I just love the idea of knowing that, folks have this lived experience already, and it's a good place. Like, this education space is where we can expand it further. I think that ties a little bit into the policy topic that I wanted to highlight, or the area I want to highlight, which I think dovetails pretty well here. And you know, you mentioned a lot of students are coming in or learning about this, engaging this, and you, I don't know, in your experience, if they're mostly learning in English, a lot of these more nuanced, advanced topics, even when you're engaging with either students or other educators, or even folks in similar spaces when we're talking about social justice issues, racial justice issues, so on and so forth. Say, for example, on this panel, right, we're speaking in English. I know that when I'm trying to explain more progressive topics to my parents, even though they are aligned, I'm blessed that they're aligned politically with me, it's still a struggle to be able to engage with them in Vietnamese or the other languages that they speak. And so this issue of language access, language barriers, whether it's in progressive spaces, we're trying to educate folks on maybe their rights, or if we want them to advocate for a certain thing, or telling our community members, this is what we need to get access to government services or resources. That's something that I'm sure folks on this call have also had experiences with too. Maybe you've been the translator, the interpreter, you've been the one pulling community resources in a language that, well, for me, I'm not perfectly fluent in. So I think hearing, Gabe, what you brought up about this entire curriculum has me really activated. And I'm also curious to see what it looks like when, you know, New Jersey just passed the language access law, what that looks like when we expand it to all of these other languages as well. The Alliance just helped, and also a lot of our other partners, including ACLU, helped push through this language access law that will mandate interpretation and translation of government resources, other services in right now the top 7 languages. We as a state and all our migrant communities have so many other languages that we speak, and there's such a richness in our culture. So, you know, hoping and knocking on wood that will expand to many languages in the future. But that's something that, even though it sounds like sometimes it's just an immigrant rights issue, I think it's something that helps connect so many different folks. How are we able to fight for issues in all these other different pockets or domains if maybe those who can't understand it in English can't join in on the fight, right? If they're speaking another language, they're much more comfortable in Creole, in Spanish, in Tagalog, so on and so forth. What would that look like for all of us to speak that collective language of liberation? I'm hoping that one day, you know, get to a point where, and I have no clue what this looks like, where the default is not always, let's do something in English and then we translate out or interpret out. That day isn't here, but I know that that's going to be in the future because we have a very, very rich, culturally rich, multicultural community that we're working with.
Oh gosh, I like feel so inspired listening to both of you. So I'm like sitting with that as I'm also thinking about responding. And I seem to have turned off my video just a second. You know, and I think linking up to what both of you shared, you know, there's so much of the work that we are all talking about is making sure that people can actually access resources, can access government, can make sure that they can truly be living in a state that is fair and welcome for everyone. And like, what does that really mean? What does that actually mean in practice? And one thing that we have heard from community members for a very long time is the reality on the ground, which is that oftentimes people might be too nervous to sign up a child for public school or take them to a vaccine clinic or report wage theft or report a crime because they worry that doing so, that in accessing services that are meant for them or by accessing services that are meant to support them or their families, that they'll somehow end up in the detention or deportation pipeline. And this is the reality for so many people. And New Jersey is an incredibly diverse state, right? We know that 1 in 4 New Jerseyans are immigrant themselves. Nearly 1 in 6 are actually the child. They have at least one immigrant parent. And so when we talk about these are issues that really impact a vast array of New Jerseyans, and they're really important. And so one thing that we are working on with our partners, including Kat and her colleagues at the Alliance for Immigrant Justice, is legislation that's going to be introduced soon called the Immigrant Trust Act. And it sounds really exactly like what it's meant to do, which is it's trying to make sure that people can really trust that they can access government safely. And the idea is that people should be able to trust that when they are doing any of these everyday activities, that they will not end up with their information shared with ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement at the federal level. There's one story that we heard from a community partner a while ago that always stays with me, of a gentleman who just had his third child and he wanted to register his child for healthcare. And so he went to to the social service agency to sign up. And unfortunately, not long after, ICE actually showed up at his door. And they detained him and his wife, had to watch them take him away. And even though he was eventually released, every few months for years and years and years, he's had to report to ICE. And every single time he does, his family doesn't know if he'll come home. His kids worry about him. And that is a reality that many people live in. And it really informs how people then choose to interact or not interact with government. And so the idea behind the Immigrant Trust Act, which like I said, is going to be introduced soon, is making sure that there's privacy protections in place so that people can actually do so and truly feel part of New Jersey, which is what I think all of us around the table want for to be the reality for everyone. I also just want to mention one other quick thing, just to your point, Fanny, about policies that we can push to advance anti-Blackness and like pushing back against people who insist on doing that, even when things like don't seem like they're disguised as something else, but we know to be true that it's really about anti-Blackness and furthering white supremacy, is really shifting our approach to drugs from one that's around the criminal legal system to public health. We know that there are so many people who are swept up into the criminal legal system for issues related to drugs. And unfortunately, what most people are really seeking is help and a public health response. And that's what evidence actually shows us that works. And so that's another issue that's a real important to us, about making sure that we are meeting people with the resources that they need and not furthering carceral approaches that are about punishment and harm, as opposed to thinking about how can we actually create communities that have systems of care and support for people.
Thank you. You have all shared some very critical issues beyond the key ones that you are working on. Right? Now, let me ask, okay, you mentioned the Immigrant Trust Act. Okay, what other initiatives, legislation, or policies or programs do you see coming down the pipeline that are promising developments? And anyone can start.
Yeah, I can start with one really quick thing, which is actually the implementation of a law that was passed earlier this year. It's called the Najee Seabrooks Law, and it's all about creating community response teams so that instead of responding with police, there is actually other teams in place that can respond to people in moments of crisis. And I think it's so important that we think about how we can build alternatives to policing and to thinking of only, like I said earlier, carceral responses to when people are seeking assistance. What's so amazing about these community crisis response teams is that it's meant to be people who are from those communities that are responding to their neighbors, offering help. And I think the implementation of that is a really exciting moment for all of us to think about how we can actually like put a lot of what we talk about, which is like building alternatives, building systems of care, putting all of those things into practice. And that's something I'm really excited to see come down the line.
And if I may, let me layer on top of that, if folks want to learn more about the Attorney General's Arrive Together program, right, they can, I invite folks to check out our website, again, njcivilrights.gov, and just navigate over to our parent page for the Attorney General. But Kat and Gabe, if you'd like to popcorn back in.
I'll just briefly share connection, not necessarily framed in a particular policy piece, but what I just heard shared by Ami, just the movement for restorative practices in schools to disrupt the school to prison pipeline and school to deportation pipeline is one of the bodies of work that we're also focused on. But the community of care piece and the resource conversation earlier, and even just the carceral state and punitive culture in which we exist is this larger overarching, dominant culture that results in some of the policies that we see, that result in, Black and brown children being disproportionately punished, expelled, in ways that do lead to a perpetuation of the carceral state, right? And mass incarceration. So, there are ways that we're, at least from the union space, we've been looking specifically at resourcing and supporting through community schools and restorative practices to shift policies and support locals that are doing some of the grassroots work. So that's one of the dynamics of the union, is that although we are the largest union in the country, we're a bottom-up grassroots community-led structure. So some of the examples that I'd like to lift up, particularly from New Jersey, one of my dear comrades, Sean Bird, doing some incredible restorative justice work in New Brunswick, Zelly Thomas in Patterson, who organizes with Black Lives Matter, and Atlantic City, and other examples within the state are some really Montclair, some really pivotal examples of the ways that we can shift culture. So that's kind of one of the balances that we also toggle between policy change and culture shift. And it's not either or, right? We need to do both. So I'm just like really enjoying hearing some of the more pragmatic policy changes that were shared. And I also, at some point, even if it's not in this flow conversation, Kat's mention of even just language access as an issue is just something that I'd love to tap back into at some point during this conversation, if we can.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like it's like a through line with a lot of multicultural, intergenerational organizing, and it comes up probably in every single conversation that I have at this point. I think what both of you shared about really like disrupting, dismantling the school to prison pipeline, for myself personally, the refugee to school to prison pipeline, or even refugee to prison pipeline, is part and parcel to the line of work that I do. On the national level, that includes the New Way Forward campaign, and also make sure I'm saying it right, the Southeast Asian Relief and Responsibility campaign, both of which would end, we'll call it for relief from folks who have already spent time or targeted in detentions and deportations since the early 2000s, and also provide or have the US take responsibility for their crimes in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and so forth. So what Gabe just said about, not only are we changing or breaking this cycle, this pipeline, we're also changing the ways in which we're viewing responsibility, and the framework in which, say, the United States is thinking about incarcerate or trying to incarcerate immigrant communities, Black and brown communities, so forth. Those two have to go hand in hand. There's a lot of work locally that's also going to be in flight there too. I know we can definitely share out more later on too, and I want to be mindful of folks' time here. I think something that I really want to kind of highlight while we're here of like what is actively happening on the ground, and some things that we can shine a light on, is the amount of incredible student activism that we've been seeing lately. And obviously that's been in the news, but we're building on legacies of that, right? From beforehand. I know Gabe shared many stories. We've all been a part of some student activist movement. And I think just plugging into what that looks like right now, I know some either encampments or other areas have died down or taken shape in different forms. But I think knowing what's happening, what students are demanding, and how they're engaging with the spaces around them can also shine a huge light on how we organize and strategize as progressive movement leaders.
There we go. Thank you all. So I'm just going to pick up on a through line to use everyone's vocabulary that was shared earlier. So we talked about language access, right? And we talked about why language rights remains an equity issue, a civil rights issue, a racial justice issue. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of the case of Lau versus Nichols, the landmark case in support of bilingual education, right? As legal experts and educational advocates have noted, this was a, quote, major civil rights victory that highlighted cross-racial collaboration between progressive Black, Latino, and Asian American communities. So we talked about intersectional justice, and cross-racial solidarity. So my question now, right, to all of you, why do you think other Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, or folks from, the larger people of color communities, or general New Jerseyans, the larger community, why should we care about working on intersectional issues, working on civil rights issues that touch us all? I see the brains thinking. And I see Ami smiling, so I'll ask Ami to pop in first.
Yeah, sure. And I think this is such an interesting question, because the way in which I see work is that I think all of these issues are inherently intersectional. Like I can't think of an issue that isn't intersectional. And so I guess I'm trying to struggle my way towards figuring out what the alternative is. I think at the end of the day, when we see things intersectionally, it's about making sure that we're truly understanding what's going on. And I think when we do so, we are able to create policies that are better for everyone. When I think a lot about some of the issues I work on, I think of how they are oftentimes put into silos, right? People sometimes assume immigrants' rights is an issue for AAPI communities or for Latinx communities. People sometimes assume that work on criminal legal reform is an issue for Black and Brown communities. And the reality is these are actually issues for all of us, and that we see the ways in which these systems are oftentimes the exact same system, with a different veneer, right? They just show up differently in different people's lives. And a lot of the work that we do around issues like what I was talking about earlier with the Immigrant Trust Act, that's an issue of what we called crimmigration, right? It's this intersection of the criminal legal system and the immigration system, where these two things have come together and not said, let's work it out and let's support people, but let us instead compound harm upon people. And so recognizing that all of these systems that exist around us, that we are all working through every single day, are sort of joining together to sort of compound harm, to expand the ways in which people experience it. It then requires us to make sure that as we're thinking through these issues and as we're trying to create responses and solutions to these issues, that we are doing the same, right? We also have to be just as smart in pulling it apart as people were in putting it together. For example, even in the immigrants' rights space, the second most common reason that people are deported is actually for a drug violation. And so even in New Jersey, where, for example, marijuana is legalized and decriminalized, people who have a prior marijuana-related record are still subject to deportation, can still make them inadmissible for a number of programs, things like DACA, for example. And so in our thinking, when we care about these issues, if we think about how they're relevant to us, I think it's so important to think about how they're relevant and how they live in other people's lives. And it's only in doing that I think we're actually able to address the root of issues. And then I'll just say from a practical perspective, we only ever win when we do it together. The work that I've been part of here in New Jersey, that I think all of us have been a bit part of wherever we've done this work, when we work collectively, when we work with one voice, when we share with the multitudes of ways in which we are experiencing different systems, It is only then that I think we can actually be successful in changing policies for the better. And so, yeah, from both the philosophical perspective, right, and like a practical, we have to get this done perspective, I think intersectionality has to be the lens through which we do all of our work.
I want to second, third, fourth, infinity every statement you just said, especially with the when we fight together, we win. And I want to also highlight one part of this, which is not just working on issues and thinking intersection, but working with the community as well, and working with those who are coming from those backgrounds, right? Different backgrounds with us than us. I think also on the tactical end, it is those who have been most impacted, most harmed by these systems, oppressed over time and time again, who have figured out to resist in their own ways and find ways to thrive or find joy despite these systems. Those are the folks who have the sharpest tools. And sometimes I'd say, even someone who's worked in policy or program development or other forms of advocacy, there have been times if I haven't listened to a community member who's been impacted in that way, that I end up reinventing the wheel or creating a solution that's honestly worse and not culturally relevant, not helpful or useful for them whatsoever. And so I just want to say that when we're thinking of, obviously it's so important that we're working across many different communities and bring everyone together, but it's something that I find extremely important to also just make sure that those who have already been doing the work, that they're platformed in this struggle as well.
Absolutely. The people that are most proximate to the issues are also the most proximate to the solutions. So I definitely feel that. And as I'm thinking about the question, the history teacher in me is coming up, and like being honest about the struggles and why, in the context of the United States, which is originally indigenous land, in New Jersey, Lenni Lenape were the people that cultivated this land for centuries before European colonization. And then the wealth that was amassed was based on forced labor of people from the African diaspora. And then for generations, exploited immigrant labor was part of the creation of, it's the story of America, right? But if that dominant narrative, right, was the only part of the story, it really is through primarily the Black liberation struggle, and then the intersections that layered in for generations and centuries to try to struggle through each generation to advance towards racial and social justice. It just a long way of saying that, to affirm rather what I heard earlier, that we win when we're working together. Even in the background of my Zoom, just lifting up my Filipino farm worker ancestors, Larry Itliong, Philip Vera Cruz, and the Filipino farm workers who, in collaboration with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, won one of the most significant victories in labor union history by working, cross-racially, cross-ethnically, and even with a language barrier, right? So they multilingual labor organizers were able to defeat those who were seeking to exploit their labor, is in a story that's largely untold, right? It's not the stories that are embedded in our curriculum, which are largely Eurocentric. And we win when we work together. That's just ringing true. And I could go on more, but I do want to make sure I leave the space for more Q&A, but also this feels like a whole conversation that I know we have a container for an hour of this conversation, but I want more of this conversation because it's so valuable. And
we can certainly do a part 2 for next year or maybe later this year. But on the note that you mentioned about Q&A, So audience members, if you have questions for our speakers, please do drop them in the Q&A tab. We will be wrapping up the formal part of this discussion in a few more minutes, and then we'll pivot to a presentation and an overview of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, and then come back to the Q&A with our speakers. Okay. So now let me ask the next question. So some of you mentioned youth and youth activism. So what advice would you give them, okay, whether they are currently engaged in activism or thinking about a career, right, like yours, that pursues anti-discrimination and cross-racial solidarity work? So the question again is, what advice would you give to others? Especially if they are foregoing careers in engineering, and what else was it? Engineering, political science, and something else, I forget. But foregoing traditional careers that many of our parents or the older generation may have pushed us into or are pushing us into for the youth.
If y'all don't mind, I'd love to jump into the question, but I'd also, in thinking about the way that you frame that, Fanny, I was thinking I'd be curious to learn what the young folks are seeing. So although I for sure would be glad to answer questions about navigating career and future and that, but I think part of what was so valuable in working with you in the classroom was just being able to learn from them and have a reciprocal dialogue. Because when we think about intergenerational, of course, as aspiring radical elders, I do hope that I have some wisdom to impart as young folks navigate, but especially in this moment, it's not a critique of the generations that preceded us or a critique of my own generation, but we're facing challenges and compounding challenges that are emerging in this moment. And I'd be leaning in with more curiosity on what the young folks think is possible in terms of solutions, in terms of radically imagining and freedom dreaming and co-creating, to use Kat's language, like to get us out of some of the challenges that we're seeing today. So that's not really responding to your answer directly, but that's what comes to mind when I think about the opportunity to dialogue with young folks. I'd be leaning in with much more curiosity, which wasn't my experience navigating as a young person, or even in professional spaces as a person perceived as a young person, whereby those who are most senior would impart their knowledge, but I would have loved to be able to engage in a reciprocal dialogue where there was space for my wisdom as a young person to emerge in the conversation.
I really love that. I couldn't agree more. I was thinking about what you just said and thinking of what Kat said earlier, and I find myself so incredibly inspired by young people and students, especially on campuses these days, who are engaging in activism that, there's a long legacy of, right? In the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Young people continually putting not just like thoughts and like philosophical musings, but action into practice. And it's been really incredible to see. And I think I want to really celebrate that, because a lot of what we're talking about now about what does it mean to see things intersectionally? What does it mean to be active in your community? That's actually what they're doing. And so if anything, I think there's room for this call that we work with to be hopefully making more room for that, and not just for and hopefully meeting them too, because I think that that's more of really what I would like to see. And to Gabe's point, as a young person, I love the way you put it, like a reciprocal conversation, and there's obviously, like you said, things we can talk about related to career or finding community or, all of those that are super important and I think have been a clear part of all of our journeys. But I think what is coming up for me is what I'm seeing students and younger people already have, which is a real clear sense of what it means to be in solidarity with one another, and also a really clear commitment to fighting for what's right.
Couldn't agree more with both of y'all. And I think the essence of it is for folks who, either are new to the space or feel like maybe their voices aren't, they're not being able to be amplified in the ways they want to. I think ultimately just following down this path is knowing that taking the step is better than not doing anything at all. Perfectionism can lead to paralysis. I know for myself, that's been many a case in knowing whether or not I was doing the right thing or not the right thing. And I think the one thing that I've always that has led me, and I feel like we could tie this into this conversation, reciprocity too, as I have like a bunch of quotes written down, but I think that's the one I attribute to Toni Morris, which is when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game. So obviously there's some elements of that, that there requires nuance. And it's not supposed to be paternalistic, but I think there's a lot to be said here about like, this is not just a grab bag candy game. This is not a zero-sum game. The more people that we have in the movement, the better. And that's always the place to start.
Thank you all. That was beautiful. So one last question before we wrap up this formal part of the discussion and we pivot is, so you all clearly have a very deep commitment to your work. So what keeps you motivated to continue this work? And what brings you joy? Fruits, as we talked about earlier. For the audience, we earlier spoke about favorite fruits, and we all agreed that they were mangoes.
It's definitely unanimous, at least for our panelists. But so to kind of bridge this question with the one earlier about engaging young folks in dialogue, I'd say at the heart of it, and as it's maybe cliche and maybe just, but relationships matter. And just like how important relationships are, is something that I wanted to just share in reflection. And I also didn't want to miss the opportunity to bridge the conversation around cross-racial solidarity, intergenerational organizing, relationship building, but also cross-sector, organizing, and lift up one other organization that I'm a part of within New Jersey, which has also had national chapters called the New Leaders Council. And that's something that I wanted to name because one of the things that keeps me afloat is my squad, is my friends, my comrades, the ones that I can talk to when I've had a hard day, when I've had victories, when I've had things that I have to navigate and unpack or analyze, or even just kick it and laugh and just like, chill. And, those relationships matter so much in keeping me afloat and bringing me joy. And honestly, part of the justice work, the joy in justice, is that you get to connect with people on a deeper values level, in the struggle, and there's a higher level of intimacy with friendships and relationships in this work that I value so greatly. So that's just one of the things that helps keep me afloat. It's the people. It's my people, right? That I get to receive support from, to sort of go back to the AAPI's community of care, but also support others along their journey. And how can I support you? Just check in, just share some music, share some vibes, share something I read recently, and also offer that joy to others as they're navigating difficult spaces in the struggle. So that's important.
Second, all of that, definitely think the community has been what's kept me afloat, will continue to keep me afloat. And I think it's especially the moments in which, you know, especially with losses, that there's always someone that reminds, like, there is liberation in our lifetime. It will happen. It will happen. And sometimes it's hard for, you know, myself to even look in the mirror and say it and believe it. But when you have a chorus of people, whether or not they fully believe it at the moment either, but when you have a chorus of people who are echoing it back at you, it's infectious. And I think on top of that, just being able to exercise like all the other different elements of my life, the creative ones, the more cultural work elements. And I think that's kept me grounded in remembering that, you know, I do this work so that everyone else can also fully experience it, that everyone has bodily autonomy to run and skate and do all this other stuff. Those are my hobbies. Or that they can also pursue their creative endeavors, right? Everyone should have the ability to do that. And that's also something I remember as I continue to do this.
I think I just want to third all of that, right? I think that community is really the heart of our work, and it's what makes it go. And it's what I think keeps all of us going too. I think oftentimes when we hear about different issues or what are described as like policy successes, things like language access that Kat talked about, or the fight in New Jersey for getting driver's licenses for all people regardless of their immigration status, or even, you know, legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana. Those are fights that took a really long time. Driver's licenses took 20 years. You know, even the work, for example, around on drugs, right? The war on drugs has existed in this country for over a century. And so these are really long fights. And I think what keeps us going is knowing that we're in it with other people who we have shared values with, and who I think are always just like there for one another. You really do build, as Gabe said, like these really intimate relationships with people that sustain you. And the other thing I think that's just really important is celebrating wins. You know, oftentimes when we're doing this work, it can feel really exhausting, and you're like, oh, I'm doing this for my 5th year, my 6th year, and this thing still hasn't happened, and we're all fighting, we're all doing everything we can. And I think the thing that keeps us going is also celebrating moments of success, of joy, of getting something through. And it's that I think keeps propelling us forward as well. So just, you know, even in the midst of all that, stop and celebrate too.
I love that. Thank you all. Okay, so at this moment, I'm going to ask that we pivot, and I will continue to stay on camera and present an overview of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, the law against discrimination, and how to file a civil rights complaint. And the speakers, I invite you to take a few minutes break because you've been on camera and been speaking for about an hour. And I invite audience members to think about and drop your questions into the Q&A tab, and we'll come back to any questions that have been shared. If not, we'll go right into our closing remarks after my presentation. Thank you. Okay. And just give me a moment as I toggle to my I hope everyone can see the screen. Okay, great. So as I mentioned, at this point, I'd like to give everyone an overview of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, the law against discrimination, and how to file a civil rights complaint. Okay. So let me go to the next slide. There we go. The New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, who are we and what do we do? Okay. So we were created by the New Jersey legislature in 1945. So that's 80 years ago. Our mission is to prevent and eliminate bias, prejudice, and discrimination in New Jersey. All very similar work to what our speakers are doing. Our vision, as our Attorney General Matthew Placken has said, is to have a New Jersey where all people are treated equally. The New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, or DCR, as we call ourselves, we enforce New Jersey's anti-discrimination laws, including the Law Against Discrimination. We refer to it as the LAD. Also, the New Jersey Family Leave Act, or the NJFLA, and the Fair Chance in Housing Act. In this presentation, I will focus more on the Law Against Discrimination, but just very briefly, the New Jersey Family Leave Act is, broad strokes, the act that states that an employee can generally take up to 12 months of job-protected leave during any 24-month period under prescribed circumstances. The Fair Chance in Housing Act, or the FCHA, again, broad strokes, this act states that a housing provider, be it a landlord, or a home seller, or a dormitory, is prohibited from asking about an applicant's criminal history on an initial application. Okay? And if anyone wishes to know fuller details about the New Jersey Family Leave Act or the Fair Chance in Housing Act, we invite you to visit our website, njcivilrights.gov. And so, as I mentioned, this overview will focus more on the law against discrimination. The LAD, the Law Against Discrimination, makes it unlawful to subject people to discrimination or harassment in the following 3 areas that I'll focus on: employment, housing and real estate, and places of public accommodation. And places of public accommodation simply means any place like a mall, a restaurant, a medical service provider, a hospital, even a police precinct, or a municipal agency. So any place where the public can go and where you are served. The Law Against Discrimination states that no employer, no housing provider, no place of public accommodation can discriminate against you, can harass you, or take any act of bias against you based on one or more of your protected categories. And there are over 20 different protected categories, and they're here on the screen, and I'll read them off. They include disability, race, color, religion, creed, national origin, nationality or ancestry, gender or sex, gender identity or expression, sexual or affectional orientation, pregnancy or breastfeeding, liability for service in the U.S. military, marital, civil union, or domestic partnership status, and in some cases, familiar status, which is in housing, lawful source of income, also in housing, age, which applies in employment, as does genetic information. And as you may see from the screen, the protected categories under the LAD are actual or perceived. And what that means is, for example, an employer, cannot deny you, cannot discriminate against you or anyone you know based on their perception of you being one thing when you're actually something else. So I'll take myself as an example, right? A future employer cannot discriminate against me because they believe that I am a Chinese citizen, when in fact I am an American citizen. I hope that makes sense. And if you wish to know more details about the law against discrimination, we have very detailed fact sheets on our website, njcivilrights.gov. Oops, sorry, I just moved my PowerPoint for a minute. And we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to hop in briefly to our NJ Bias Investigation Access System. So if you believe that you have been discriminated against, if you're based on one of your protected categories by an employer, a housing provider, or a place of public accommodation, you have the right to file a civil rights complaint with the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. And we have an online portal system, and it can be simply accessed on our website, which you can see on the bottom, bias, BIAS .njcivilrights.gov. When you go to this website, bias.njcivilrights.gov, you will see this screenshot, and you can start to file a complaint, and you can set up an account. And if you cannot access this online portal system, we also, of course, have a phone number, and we dropped it in the chat, and we will drop it again later on. You can call that number, and you can get phone assistance with one of our receptionists. Okay, so let me go to the next slide, because again, this is an overview. Okay, but let me do say, if anyone in this audience or anyone you know wishes to have a fuller presentation about the law against discrimination or any of the other anti-discrimination acts that I mentioned earlier, a fuller Know Your Rights presentation, I invite you all to contact the community relations team and invite us into your community space, because we are willing and able to travel across the state to talk to people about their civil rights and how they are indeed, how you all are indeed protected by our anti-discrimination laws. So these are actual cases that you see on the screen that have been filed with the New Jersey Division of Civil Rights. So the first one I will cover was race discrimination in a place of public accommodation. An Asian American couple claimed that they were discriminated against by a chain restaurant in New Jersey, and they received disparate service because of their race. Another case filed with the division was a gender discrimination and unequal pay case by an employer. A female AT&T employee alleged that she was paid significantly less than her male colleague, despite having similar qualifications, being hired the same year, and performing similar work. Another case, religious discrimination by a housing provider. Muslim apartment seekers filed a complaint against a landlord who refused to rent to them, saying, "I don't rent to Muslims." If you'd like to learn more about cases that New Jersey Division of Civil Rights has handled and the insights, the resolutions, how New Jersey Division of Civil Rights were able to help the complainants, please do, either go to our website, njcivilrights.gov, or contact the Community Relations Unit, and we can come into your space to do fuller presentations and give you more insight to what we do. And I'm going to go to the next slide. If you didn't get enough of us this evening and you'd like to join the Division of Civil Rights for more webinars, I invite you to 2 upcoming ones, including one next Wednesday, May 22nd, also starting at 6:30, and that is the Black Men's Mental Health webinar entitled, "I Am My Brother's Keeper." If you can see the QR code, feel free to scan that, or you can go onto the registration link, or very simply go onto our website, njcivilrights.gov, to find out more information. The next webinar that I invite you to join us for is also on a Wednesday, but 2 Wednesdays from now, May 29th, and this webinar starts at 10 a.m. And this one is entitled "Undervalued: The Impact of Appraisal Discrimination on New Jersey's Communities of Color." Again, more information, including program details and registration links, can be found on our website. And all webinars are free. Registration is required. As we have dropped in the chat this evening, we invite you all to stay connected with the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, our website, our email, our Facebook and Twitter handles, our phone number, which is 1-833-NJ-DCR for you, and of course, the website for the online portals complaint system, bias.njcivilrights.gov. You see that all on the screen here, and we have dropped them in the chat, and all this information again is available on our website, njcivilrights.gov. Finally, thank you all for bearing with me with this presentation. And this is a disclaimer that we must say, please be advised that New Jersey Division of Civil Rights and its employees, including myself, we do not provide legal counsel or legal advice, and we do not comment on ongoing investigations or litigation. I hope you have found this presentation helpful, and if you do need to file a civil rights complaint with the New Jersey Division of Civil Rights, please do so. Okay, and let me stop sharing the screen, and we will pivot back to any questions. Can we have a copy of the flyer is in the question for "I Am My Brother's Keeper" webinar, please. Yes, Maggie, I see you. I have your email. I will contact you with that, okay? Ami, Kat, and Gabriel, I invite you back on camera to say one last word before I invite T. Leonardo Santiago, our director, to do closing remarks. And I'm just being mindful of time. I do know we're going over a bit, and I thank you for your patience, everyone. And I see that Kat unfortunately had to drop for family matters, but Ami and Gabe, I'm glad that you're still here, and participants, I'm glad that you're still here. Any closing remarks from Ami and Gabe before I invite T in?
I was just gonna say, I saw in one of the Q&A comments from I think it's Maggie, like offering and welcoming more collaboration in the future. And so I just wanted to say I hope that, what the conversation we have here only continues, and that this is a start to more and more from all of us on this, and maybe to Gabe's point in part two, I don't know, but all I wanted to say is, thank you for creating the space, and more to come.
Just building on that, just expressing gratitude to the team for all the work and dialogue, Ami and Kat. I know that we're over time, but just there was so much rich dialogue, and looking forward to staying in touch with all the participants and building this movement together.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Ami. T, would you like to join us and offer closing remarks?
Yes, I would. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much to tonight's speakers, Ami, Kat, and Gabriel, for sharing your beautiful journeys to becoming advocates and the current work that you're doing. Your wisdom and courage is truly inspiring. To our moderator and program lead, Fanny, and our community relations unit, Patricia, Kai, Angela, and Taylor, and Dave, for your tech support and logistics in putting this program together. Ami said, community is the heart of our work, and it's clear how much heart and soul each one of you pour into your jobs. From a personal perspective, I can relate to how advocacy work can sometimes take a personal toll, especially when the wheels of justice seem to have stopped or are turning very slowly, and how important it is to practice self-care as we care for others. Tonight, your lived experiences as community advocates have beautifully illustrated how important and possible it is for us to be in community with one another and to address bias and discrimination as we work towards justice, equity, and inclusion for immigrants, students, women, LGBTQ communities, our Black and Brown communities, who may include all people of races, including our Asian folks. The three of you exemplify the importance of intentional allyship, working in intersectional spaces, building cross-racial solidarity. You remind me of something I once heard. Kin folks are not all skin folks, meaning that we can be allied to someone who looks different from us, and someone from a different background can also be an ally to us. You spoke about how we don't have to agree on every point to work together and advance common goals that promote equity and justice. You spoke about practicing everyday acts against racism and xenophobia by showing up in spaces as our authentic selves, being inquisitive about others, and taking positive steps towards allyship and partnership. To our participants tonight, we hope that you have also learned this evening how you can support each other, how to report bias, discrimination, and harassment if you or someone you know believes that their rights have been violated by an employer, a housing provider, or a service provider, or a place of public accommodation. On behalf of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights Community Relations team, I'd once again like to thank our speakers for all that participate in tonight's webinar. We hope that you walk away inspired by the stories, the information, and the resources shared today. Please, let's keep the conversation going. Share the resources, and once this video is posted, please share the video as well. We hope that you'll stay connected with our speakers, with their organizations, with the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights hereafter, so we can work together to create a more equitable New Jersey. And with that, have a great night.